Make politics boring again. Make politics boring again. Make politics boring again. Make politics boring again. Make politics boring
Hello and
again.
welcome to another episode of Make Politics Boring Again. This week I'll be answering another 5 questions that have been sent in, and don't forget that you can send your own questions through the contact form on my website, makepoliticsboringagain.co.uk, or you can send them to me on Instagram at makepoliticsboringagain. So the first question we have this week is from Carol in Dorset, and she asks, how will the US and UK's plans for AI development compare with each other? So that's, of course, a very timely question because now Donald Trump is back in the White House and we have a bit more of an idea about what his plans are for the tech industry and for AI. So let's get right into it. So the US and UK are obviously two of the biggest players in the global tech industry. But in order to maintain that position, they need to dominate the AI sector. Now, both countries recognise that AI is critical to the future of their economies, but their strategies differ based on their economic and strategic realities. So let's first look at America's strategy. Their strategy for AI focuses on using companies like OpenAI, Microsoft, and Google to ensure that America dominates the industry because this allows them to control regulation and the distribution of profits. This business-first approach is, of course, typical of American capitalism, and it involves close collaboration between the state and private corporations in order to maintain those technological and economic advantages over rivals like China, for example. Their strategy is also tied to its defense and surveillance industries. For example, Project Maven uses AI to analyze drone footage and improve military accuracy, which demonstrates how AI development serves both state and corporate interests rather than the public good. On the other side of the Atlantic, here in the UK, we're positioning ourselves more as a leader in AI safety and governance. So we have initiatives like the AI Safety Summit and institutions like the Alan Turing Institute, which aims to balance investment with ethical innovation. But so far, the UK has been quite soft on regulation and focusing instead on attracting investment rather than enforcing any strict ethics on the industry. The UK's focus on ethical AI is commendable, but we're currently lagging behind the EU in implementing comprehensive regulations, especially in areas like data privacy and ensuring the accountability of corporations. I think that this is quite a weak approach and could be interpreted as a PR strategy to present the UK as a responsible AI hub while still prioritising private capital over societal well-being. Let's be clear though, AI was not created for the public's convenience. It's a tool for corporations to reduce labour costs, increase their productivity, and to extract data from its users. Automation and algorithms replace human workers not out of necessity, but because they are more profitable for corporations. The rise of tools like ChatGPT illustrates this duality of AI, because while it can be useful and enjoyable, it's also designed for data extraction and workforce replacement. If these tools were purely for public benefit, they wouldn't offer free tiers that use our data to refine their algorithms. And as the saying goes, if a product is free, then it's you who's the product. America and the UK have slightly different priorities in their approaches to AI development, but they're ultimately two sides of the same coin. America focuses on innovation and dominance, while the UK is emphasising ethics and governance. But I don't feel that either approach sufficiently addresses the societal risks of AI development that I've already mentioned, like worker displacement, the exploitation of data, or increased surveillance. The UK's slower and more ethics-focused approach might appear safer than America's aggressive pursuit of dominance, but without robust enforcement and worker protections, it still prioritises corporate interests over public welfare. I personally believe that in order for AI to truly serve society, it must be democratized and used to meet human needs, rather than just to create more profits for corporations. This will require us to move beyond capitalism, because if we remain under the current system, AI will only continue to exacerbate inequality and displace workers while still being framed as a tool for progress. Regulation and education are critical first steps, but they must be part of a broader movement to challenge the structures driving AI development. We could explore further differences between America and the UK's approaches, particularly in areas like data surveillance and workforce automation. But if you want a deeper dive into these topics, I'd suggest reading a book called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. So, to answer this question, both countries are striving to lead in AI, but their efforts reflect the desires of capitalism rather than the public good. Until AI development is democratized, it will remain a tool for consolidating power in the hands of a few, while leaving workers and the public vulnerable to exploitation and surveillance. The next question we have is, should the voting age be lowered to 16 in the UK? I personally believe that it should be lowered to 16, because at 16, young people can already work, they can pay taxes, and they can join the armed forces. So if they're already able to contribute to the economy and the state, but they don't have the right to vote on who governs that state, then this simply amounts to a form of exploitation, and I strongly believe that there should be no taxation without representation. 16-year-olds already have a number of other responsibilities too, like applying for a passport, consenting to sex, and getting a provisional driver's license. So if the government deems them mature enough to make these significant decisions, it's contradictory to deny them a political voice. Let's not forget that young people are directly impacted by government policies, particularly in areas like education, climate change, and economic justice, so they deserve representation and influence. A common argument against this is that 16-year-olds lack the maturity or the knowledge to vote, but this reflects the deeper issue about the lack of political education in the current system. And this gap in our education is not accidental. Capitalist systems have very little incentive to educate the working class about politics and economics, because an informed and engaged population could challenge existing power structures. Political maturity and knowledge are developed through active participation, and allowing young people to vote would encourage their engagement and strengthen democracy over time. Countries like Finland and Norway have successfully implemented programs to teach students how to recognise fake news, which helps them to counter misinformation and manipulation. The UK should adopt similar policies so that its younger population are prepared for the responsibilities of voting. To address this, I have started a petition to make politics, philosophy, and economics mandatory subjects in secondary schools. These topics are essential, but they're only accessible at A level in the UK, so many young people leave school without a basic understanding of political systems and critical thinking. I'll leave a link for the petition in the description below this episode. And I'd really appreciate it if you could check it out, sign it if you agree with it, and share it with other people who you might think agree as well. The claim that 16-year-olds are too immature to vote also applies to many adult voters. Adults often fall victim to manipulative campaigns and misinformation, and this has been demonstrated by the rise of figures like Nigel Farage and Donald Trump. If we were to disqualify voters based on their maturity or susceptibility to manipulation, a significant portion of the electorate would then be excluded from voting. Encouraging 16-year-olds to vote gives them a sense of belonging and civic responsibility, and it helps to create lifelong voting habits, which then strengthens the democratic process. Allowing 16-year-olds to vote is an important step towards democratizing power, but unfortunately it's not a solution to the broader systemic issues of electoral democracy under capitalism. Voting exists within a system where wealth and power distort the outcome of elections, and simply lowering the voting age won't resolve these contradictions. The real challenge is ensuring that the voices of young people and the working class as a whole are genuinely heard and valued. This requires us to fight for policies that address wealth inequality, that expand access to education and healthcare, and reduce the influence of corporate interests in politics. Lowering the voting age is just one piece of a larger struggle for a more inclusive and equitable democracy. If we equip younger generations with the tools to challenge inequality and advocate for systemic change, then we can lay the foundation for a more just and inclusive society. So, our third question of this episode is, how can universal basic income address economic inequality? So, if you haven't heard of economic basic income before, also known as UBI, it's an idea that would provide all citizens with a guaranteed and unconditional sum of money every month. It would reduce poverty and provide a safety net for those people in precarious jobs, and it would also help to counter the impact that automation is having on employment, which I mentioned earlier in the question about AI. It would also enable individuals to pursue education, become entrepreneurs, or provide more care to their families without becoming financially insecure. But there are critics of the policy who say that UBI could be prohibitively expensive and require significant tax increases or cuts to existing welfare programs. They also claim that it wouldn't address systemic inequalities like those in housing or healthcare, which would limit its overall impact. UBI is often a controversial topic because it involves the redistribution of wealth, and it would provide the working class with a baseline of economic security, which means that workers won't be so dependent on low-paying jobs and they're less likely to be exploited by capitalism. If we tax wealth and corporate profits, as well as the automation used by corporations to generate those profits, we can redirect those taxes to fund UBI. This would enable workers to reclaim a larger share of the value that they help to produce, and we can then begin to address the vast accumulation of wealth that capitalism allows. By doing this, we also challenge the capitalist notion that an individual's worth is determined solely by their contribution to the labour market. UBI could open the door to a broader questioning of capitalist norms. By decoupling income from employment, it highlights the fundamental injustice of a system where our survival depends on our labour, which benefits the wealthy. UBI would also recognise and compensate us for unpaid labour, like looking after our children and elderly parents and doing domestic work. These are all required in order for capitalism to function, but they're not paid for, so capitalism is exploiting them, and this disproportionately affects women who are often unpaid for the care that they provide. There's already been international and UK-based experiments with the implementation of UBI. For example, Finland's 2017 to 2018 pilot showed that UBI had little effect on employment rates, which is significant because a common argument against UBI is that it would discourage people from working. Finland's program also revealed that recipients experienced improved well-being and reduced stress, which is good for both workers and employers. In the UK, Wales launched a 2023 pilot where it gave every 18-year-old leaving care £1,600 per month for 2 years with the aim of improving their mental health and their financial security. Early feedback from the pilot has shown that the participants did experience reduced stress levels and more stability in terms of their mental health and their finances. A study in Scotland from 2020 found that UBI could reduce poverty and inequality, but there were also challenges like the high costs and the need for UK government cooperation. But all of these examples show that UBI can improve workers' well-being and financial security, and it helps to dispel fears about its impact on employment. There are, of course, legitimate criticisms of UBI from all realms of the political spectrum, though. Critics on the left have argued that it could actually become a tool to stabilise capitalism rather than dismantle it, because they believe that we need to make structural changes to the ownership of the means of production and move towards more of a cooperative model where the workers have a greater share in the business. Otherwise, UBI might simply become a plaster for systemic issues rather than actually being a transformative solution. There's also concern that UBI could be used to justify cuts to other welfare programs or to pacify workers without actually addressing the deeper inequalities in housing, healthcare, and education. Despite these challenges, I believe that UBI could be a stepping stone towards a post-capitalist society. If we reduce economic insecurity, we can empower individuals to imagine and design alternatives to capitalism. I've already talked about how automation is reducing the demand for human labour, so universal basic income could help us to transition to a society where production is oriented towards meeting our needs rather than just generating profit. Don't get me wrong though, UBI can't dismantle capitalism alone, but it can disrupt its exploitative systems and enable us to imagine a more equal society. We're going to take a short break now, and when we come back, I'll be answering the final 2 questions. And just a little reminder that you can send in your own questions or just your opinions on what's going on in the news, what's going on in politics, or just your thoughts on the podcast in general. You can get in contact through my website, through the contact form, makepoliticsboringagain.co.uk, or you can message me on Instagram at makepoliticsboringagain.
Please hold and we'll answer your call as soon as possible.
Make politics boring again. Make politics boring again.
Our 4th question of this episode is, does humanity have a moral obligation to colonize space? Let's put this question into context. Space exploration is currently dominated by capitalist interests and driven by billionaires like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, whose main goals are increasing profits, extracting resources, and ensuring their own survival. They are not concerned about addressing humanity's needs. The wealthy and powerful quite often frame space colonization as a moral duty because it allows them to justify enormous investments in space while ignoring the suffering and exploitation that carries on here on Earth. So space colonization is not about saving humanity. It's about securing new resources and markets for the 1% to extract profits from. For example, asteroid mining is framed as a way to access untapped wealth, but the profits from these ventures go straight into the hands of private corporations. This relentless focus on space is a dangerous diversion because it allows the ruling class to avoid accountability for Earth's problems by offering the illusion of escape. The wealthy see colonizing space as an opportunity to abandon a planet that they've exploited and polluted, leaving the majority of humanity behind to suffer the consequences. I believe that the focus should be on solving humanity's existing problems like climate change, wealth inequality, and resource scarcity. These crises are the results of specific economic and social systems. Redirecting resources from space exploration to addressing these issues on Earth would have a far greater impact on human survival and well-being. The original question asks whether we have a moral obligation to colonize space, and from the perspective of my own philosophy, which is called nihilistic naturalism, the idea of a moral obligation is irrelevant. Morality is a social construct that is used to justify actions that align with the interests of those in power. When we remove the need for morality, we can shift our focus to the material realities of who benefits, who suffers, and what consequences arise from space colonization. Meaningful space exploration would only be justified if it served humanity as a whole rather than perpetuating inequality and exploitation. This would require a post-capitalist system where resources are allocated democratically and where the benefits are shared rather than simply becoming private profits. It would also require ethical considerations about the impact on extraterrestrial environments and potential life forms. Until these conditions become reality, space colonization will remain a project of the capitalist elite as a means to secure their power and wealth, rather than a collective effort to benefit humanity. If space colonization is to have any legitimacy, it must be part of a broader project to evolve beyond capitalism and build a more sustainable society which prioritizes the well-being of all people rather than serving as an escape hatch for the privileged few. And now we come to the final question of this episode. What lessons can modern democracies learn from the fall of ancient Rome? This is a great question to end on because there's a lot of different answers that I could give to this. So I'll try to keep it to just a few so I don't go on for ages, because it would be quite fun to do a whole podcast episode on this alone. So the fall of ancient Rome is quite a useful example to use when we want to critique modern democracies, particularly when it comes to issues like class struggle, economic inequality, and the fragility of state power under capitalism. But instead of viewing Rome's fall as a standalone historical event, it should be interpreted as the failure of slavery as a mode of production. So these lessons are relevant today as modern democracies face crises rooted in the contradictions of capitalism. So one of the key drivers of Rome's decline was the concentration of wealth among elites and the inequality that resulted from that. Large landowners amassed vast estates and relied on slave labour, which displaced the smaller farmers who migrated to cities searching for work. This economic inequality widened the gap between the ruling elite and the masses, and modern democracies face similar challenges under capitalism, where the wealthiest 1% control a disproportionate share of resources, while workers struggle with stagnant wages, precarious employment, and rising living costs. Modern democracies face similar challenges under capitalism, where the wealthiest 1% control a disproportionate share of resources, while workers struggle with stagnant wages and precarious employment, while also experiencing rising living costs. Unchecked inequality undermines social cohesion and breeds discontent, which then threatens the stability of the state. If we want to avoid a similar fate, we need to redistribute wealth through progressive taxation and to improve our social welfare programs. We also need collective ownership of land, infrastructure, and natural resources to ensure that these key assets are managed democratically so that we prioritise the common good over private profit. Rome's dependence on military power also contributed to its decline. Constant warfare drained the empire of its resources and diverted attention away from critical domestic issues like poverty and inequality. Modern democracies, particularly the United States, prioritize huge defense budgets, endless wars, and military industrial interests over public welfare. It's a well-known fact that America spends more on defense than the next 10 countries combined, while simultaneously neglecting healthcare, education, and infrastructure. This mirrors Rome's failure to address internal problems, as resources were funneled into maintaining dominance rather than solving domestic issues. Another major factor of Rome's downfall was the declining trust and participation in political institutions. Political corruption, the centralization of power, and the erosion of democratic traditions alienated the population. The masses were pacified with superficial entertainment and welfare provisions, while deeper systemic issues went unresolved. Modern democracies face similar challenges today. Voter turnout is declining, public trust in institutions is at an all-time low, and corporate influence over politics has alienated people from the political process. Superficial distractions like social media and populist rhetoric continue to divert attention from urgent issues like inequality and climate change. True political engagement can only be restored through systemic change that empowers workers and communities to take democratic control over political and economic institutions. But perhaps the ultimate reason for Rome's collapse was tied to its reliance on slavery, which was a mode of production that couldn't adapt to economic and social changes. Slavery created immense wealth for the elite, but became unsustainable as the empire stopped expanding and the supply of slaves diminished. In the same way, modern capitalism relies on infinite growth in a finite world, which has led to crises like climate change, resource depletion, and economic instability. Just as Rome's reliance on slavery became untenable, capitalism's dependence on overproduction and underconsumption is unsustainable. We must transition to a more fair and sustainable system such as socialism if we're going to prevent collapse. The fall of ancient Rome was not due to moral decay or individual failures. It was the inevitable result of systemic contradictions, including economic inequality, over-reliance on militarization, a severe loss of public trust, and an unsustainable reliance on slavery. This shows that no system lasts forever, and the lessons are especially relevant today as capitalism faces similar crises. Wage labour is the current mode of production, and it depends on endless growth and profit, but its contradictions like overproduction, inequality, and resource depletion make it unsustainable and likely to collapse over time. Solving these issues requires more than patching up broken institutions or making small reforms, as parties like Labour, the Tories, the Republicans, and Democrats often attempt to do. The real solution lies in fundamentally rethinking the economic and political systems that underpin modern democracies. Without addressing the root causes of inequality and alienation, modern societies risk collapsing, just like ancient Rome. But its failure won't be a sudden tragedy, it will be a predictable outcome of systemic flaws. That's all we have time for on this episode, but I hope those answers were helpful to you, and thank you so much for everyone who sent their questions in. Please tune in next week when I'll be answering more of your questions, and you can send them in through the form on my website at makepoliticsboringagain.co.uk, or you can contact me on Instagram at makepoliticsboringagain. Thanks again for listening, look after each other, and see you next week.
Make politics boring again. Make politics boring again. Make politics boring again. Make politics boring again.